Hello, welcome to Guide London. My name's Nick Salmond. I'm a member of the Association of Professional Tourist Guides, and that's the organisation behind the Guide London website and the organisation responsible for these broadcasts. Now, London's been in lockdown for just around a year now, and we started these broadcasts to try and bring you a little bit of London into your homes. We're not allowed to guide around London at the moment. Many of the famous buildings are closed, many of the streets are closed, the public transport is very quiet. But what we thought we could do is bring you a series of videos, bringing you a little bit about the history of London, about some of the people who've lived here, and about some of the famous buildings that you can go and visit. Now, over the last year, we've done around 70 of these different videos. You can find them all on our YouTube channel. Just go and search for Guide London, or you can find them on Facebook or Twitter. And over that time, we've talked about some of the famous people who've lived in London, including some of the kings and queens. We've talked about Queen Victoria. We talked about George IV. But one person that we haven't really mentioned is perhaps the most famous king of them all, and that is King Henry VIII, the man you've seen in all those films and those television series, famous, of course, for his 6 wives. He ruled the country for about 37 years during one of the most turbulent times in English history. And today we're going to learn all about some of the places associated with King Henry VIII in London. And to do that, I'm delighted to say that I'm joined today by my colleague and London Blue Badge tourist guide, William Harry Mitchell. Will is going to tell us all about some of those places associated with Henry VIII in London. Now, we are broadcasting live, so if you've got a burning question that you've always wanted to know about Henry VIII or any of his 6 wives, then just put it in the comments and we'll try and answer the questions at the end of the programme. But without more ado, I'm going to hand over to Will, who's going to tell us all about Henry VIII in London. Will.
Thank you very much, Nick. Yes, so as Nick says, one of probably our most famous king that we've ever had, Henry VIII, who ruled in those early years of the 1500s, from 1509 to 1547. Yes, he's very famous for having his 6 wives. He had his 3 legitimate surviving children, and he was a king who was very much on the transition of things between the medieval and the early modern period. So he was a king in that early Renaissance. And just look at him there in that slide. He's wearing all that sort of incredibly sort of elaborate costume, and he has all those wonderful textiles behind him. And that was the thing, because you see, the Renaissance was an incredibly expensive time to be a king. You had to have these wonderful new fashions, these wonderful new buildings. You had to modernize everything. And for Henry, that meant he needed a lot of money. Now, he needed money because he needed to keep changing his clothing. And one of the things he did also do is he built a lot of palaces, over 50 palaces. Some of them are still around. He built castles everywhere to protect his coasts. They were mostly sort of artillery forts, but he built them. And in his time, his great need for money destroyed a lot of what had been England up to that point. So he destroyed the state religion that had existed before that and supplanted it with his new Church of England. He destroyed forests in order to build his new navies. He debased the currency. He actually made the pound inflate in value crazily, and he destroyed the monasteries, the heart of medieval life, the thing that sort of gave England that link back to its old history. And in doing all that, he was always chasing that sort of excellence. But he did also give us a couple of quite interesting things. He changed our social hierarchy. So from after Henry's time, if you were incredibly capable, you could actually succeed in life. You didn't have to be born into the ranks of the advisors to the kings. And of course, as I say, he gave us our new religion. Now, today we're going to look at the things that remain of Henry, things that you can still see in London today that Henry might have seen, and places that he would have been familiar with. So we're going to start off where Henry was born, in Greenwich. Henry was born at Greenwich Palace. This is what you see today when you're standing sort of at the Watergate, so the River Thames behind us and Greenwich in front of us. Now, this is what we call now the old Royal Naval College, or what it is, the Palace of Greenwich. But this is not the palace that Henry would have known, with these great, lovely wings on either side of us, and the Queen's house ahead of us at the end there. In fact, we've got a picture of it behind, because you can see in this picture, we're now looking out towards the river, and you can see the city of London beyond. Well, you can see Canary Wharf, but you can see that there is urbanization around us right here. And in Henry's time, this was this palace, the Palace of Plaisance, was out in the middle of nowhere. It was a lovely spot to go hunting. He loved going there. I think he said it was his favorite palace, away from the city, out to the east where the air was fresher. And he was born there, and so were both of his daughters, Elizabeth and Mary. They were both born there at Greenwich. But as I say, the palace didn't look like this in his day. This is what it looked like now. Now, in the visitor centre here in Greenwich, you have these lovely models and a lot of information there that tells you about what the palace was like in his day. And again, you'll see down at the bottom here, this is the River Thames, and that tower that's sticking out towards us, that's Henry's Watergate. So these sort of courtyards, this big area, and the museum, the visitor centre, does a really good attempt at showing us kind of what the architecture might have been like, and really creating the feel of Henry's palace. We have this lovely stained glass that's been recreated, that sits in their part of the museum. Just there, you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, that's Henry's coat of arms recreated with the red and white roses fused together to make the Tudor rose at the top there. And then on the right there, the coat of arms of Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn. It was in the time that Henry was married to Anne that he had one of the sort of most significant moments that happened to him in his life occur. While he was at Greenwich, he was always very fond of jousting in his youth, and he was jousting in Greenwich, and history tells us that he was knocked from his horse and that he was unconscious for maybe up to 2 hours, which is an incredible amount of time to be unconscious. It is thought that potentially you can sort of draw a line at this point that beforehand Henry he's a little bit monstrous at times, but he's mostly sort of bluff King Hal, quite a fun-loving young Renaissance prince. And then after this point, after his accident, he does become a bit of an awful tyrant, and it will have very bad consequences for the wife that he was married to at that point, because he does injure himself. But there's very little of Henry's palace that you can actually see in situ today. You can see a little bit of the foundations, which have now been revealed beneath the painted hall in the old Royal Naval College. But while you are there, you should go and see the painted hall itself. So you go upstairs there and you see this wonderful gallery. It's got these gorgeous paintings on the ceiling. There are a few of them, but this is the centerpiece of the main one with our King, Queen, William and Mary seated in the center there. Just absolutely stunning. You could spend an entire afternoon in there, but you know, if you only have one afternoon in Greenwich, then keep going, because you've got the chapel nearby. That's also amazing, and all the architecture of the actual of the Greenwich Naval Hospital. You will recognize it because it turns up in movies all over the place. It's in things like Thor 2, Thor Dark World, and also in The Crown. The latest series of The Crown uses Greenwich to stand in for Buckingham Palace quite regularly. And you will have seen any film where you've seen London back in the 17 or 1800s, you're probably seeing some shots of Greenwich in there. And while you're looking around for Crown architecture, Crown filming locations, why not also look for places from Bridgeton? Because the Queen's house that we saw earlier was using Bridgeton, and here we see the Ranger's house up on the so down to the south of Greenwich, at the edge of Greenwich Park. This is the Bridgeton's London home. And that is, you know, it's just one of these gorgeous places. Today it houses a wonderful art exhibition known as the Werner Collection, that's inside there, and it sits just on the edge between the park and between this other massive green area in that part of London known as Blackheath. And we're going to see a map now of the park at the top, and then Blackheath spreading out below us down to the south. And Blackheath was quite a significant place. It was somewhere where armies often camped, maybe before they went into London. So in 1381, so before Henry's time, the Peasants' Revolt waited here before they flooded down to London the next day. but it was a convenient spot for there to be grand meetings of people who are coming up from Dover and from the coast, from France. So this is where Henry met in great pomp and ceremony his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. Now, technically, Henry had already snuck down to her en route to London to meet her and not have to meet her in front of everybody else. And he didn't really like what he'd seen, and she didn't really like what she'd seen in him. So when they actually met at Blackheath, this grand affair, a bit of a damp squib really, and all the waiting Londoners weren't particularly happy to see that. But if we go further south than Blackheath, all the way down quite a long way, we get to Elton Palace. Now, this is a little gem that's very much hidden away in the southeast of London. Elton Palace is where the Tudors sent their children to grow up. So Henry and his siblings, they were raised at Elton Palace. There's a story of Erasmus visiting Henry VIII. He was one of the premier minds of Europe at the time, one of the people leading the Renaissance. Great humanist scholar, and he met all the children of Henry's dad, Henry VII, here at Elton Palace. And it was also a place that Henry liked to spend a lot of his time when he was quite young. He liked to hunt around here and things like that. Later on, he builds a chapel. Sadly, the chapel is now gone as well, and quite a lot of what Henry gave us is gone as well. This hall survives. This was built just a little bit before Henry's time, so he would have known it. And inside, we've got some more stained glass reproductions again, but some of our medieval kings' coats of arms there. And then on the right there, Henry VIII's coat of arms. And you know it's a Tudor coat of arms because beneath it, we have the Red Dragon of Wales, because the Tudor household were a Welsh dynasty that were now in charge of England. But whenever Henry was, nowadays, Eltham is a little bit more, most of Eltham is a bit more Art Deco. And you can see those buildings in the background there behind me. We've still got a little bit of the bridge there, the old medieval bridge that was probably in use in Henry's time, but mostly Art Deco. And the interiors there are phenomenal. Sorry, this photo on the left came out a bit dark, but believe me, the dark wall there has some beautiful wood inlays with these Greco-Roman sort of figures on it. And over here on the right, this wonderful bathtub. If you could have your bathroom festooned in golden tiles, why wouldn't you? So absolutely a great place to visit. I would highly recommend, if you're down south, to have a look. If you can do a day split between Greenwich and Eltham, absolutely great. Or maybe spend a few days down in that part of London. Now, Eltham was, as I say, the place that Henry went when he was quite young. It was also somewhere where his counsellor, Cardinal Wolsey, would often be put. This is the man who would control Henry's household for him. He would be put at Eltham, and he would control Eltham while Henry was having fun up at Greenwich as well. And it's here where Cardinal Wolsey comes up with the Eltham Ordinances, which very much redefine how Henry's household will run. So this is in the early 1520s. And Wolsey's a little bit disappointed that Henry has all these louts from his youth, these great jousters, these great drinkers, so these party guys who hang around with Henry, and so the cardinal sets up a way of organising Henry's household, the Eltham Ordinances, which will get rid of all these unsavoury types. But of course, as soon as Henry gets rid of Wolsey a little bit later, he brings them all back again, and we have this return of the fun people to Henry's court. But let's move on. Let's go see another palace now, because we're going to see one that there isn't a huge amount of it left for us to see, but Richmond Palace. Again, another palace that would have been there in Henry's youth, built by his father, who we see there, Henry VII. And this was a palace, again, right on the River Thames, but now we're way to the west of London. And it's his father, who is the Earl of Richmond, before he's king, who actually gives this area of London its name. He calls it Richmond because beforehand it was called Sheen. Richmond is really this place up in Yorkshire that he was the Earl of. And then when he builds his palace, he calls it Richmond Palace, and the whole area becomes known as Richmond. Today, all that is left of this fantastic palace is just this little gatehouse, and that's what you can go and see when you're there. But if you do pop in to Richmond, then you can go to the actual sort of town itself nearby, and it's just this lovely suburban area, great pubs. There's a sort of bit of a quirk of the Thames at this point, so the River Thames actually floods up a little bit, and you can get flooded into one of the pubs, and you'll get stuck in for the whole day, which is so terrible that you have to drink all day while you're there in the pubs in Richmond. But that's a good place in suburban London to go and have a look around Richmond. The palace itself became a little bit more of a lesser palace. Henry VIII spends his first Christmas there with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and then later it becomes more of a palace for princes or for queens. And the Spanish ambassador spends a lot of time visiting Catherine at Richmond Palace. But another palace that was important, more of a castle really, was the Tower of London. Now again, Henry's very, very keen on this grand statement of English power, and it's the most famous one of the palaces, probably even more than Buckingham Palace today, which is not to do with Henry. The Tower of London sits there, and Henry really enjoyed going there early on. He does a lot of work to make it look a little bit more modern. In fact, in the centre there, you can see this grand square tower known as the White Tower, and Henry adds those domes on top of it, those rounded domes. I think their real name is actually OG Cupola. We just generally call them onion domes, and it's a great sort of signifier that you're looking at Tudor architecture if you see these domes on top of the palaces. Henry puts them on there for his second wife, for Anne Boleyn. So he's put Catherine Aragon aside by this point, and he's marrying Anne Boleyn, and he wants to make the place look really fancy for her coronation party. And he builds actually a palace as well there, more palace buildings. So if we were looking across the river as we are here at the Tower of London in Henry's day, we would see quite a lot of roofs between us and that big tower in the middle there. And he built a great big hall for Anne Boleyn to have her party in it. But then, as I say, he had his accident. He changes, he becomes much more angry, and he's convinced by one of his councillors, and it's kind of what he wants to do anyway, that to put Anne Boleyn on trial. She's put on trial in the Great Hall there at the Tower of London. She's found guilty of adultery against the king, and I'm sure the charges were completely fabricated and there's no truth to any of them really. But she's found guilty of adultery and of wishing the king's death, and so she is executed inside the Tower of London there. Now, before the 20th century, there were 10 people who were executed on Tower Green inside the tower. And of those 10, 4 of them were executed by Henry VIII. 2 of them were his queens, his second queen, Anne Boleyn, her sister-in-law, Jane Boleyn, and then his fifth queen, Catherine Howard. And then he also executes an old 60-year-old lady called Margaret Pole, who's part of a family who he's worried that they could possibly supplant his children later on. So he wants to get rid of all the Poles from the country. But there we are. Now, on a sort of earlier, happier note for Henry, this is also the place that he set off for his coronation. So Henry VIII set out from the Tower of London, and he travelled through the streets of London, and people hung out their wonderful tapestries from their windows and cloth of gold, and all the folk of London, all the guilds came out in their full regalia and sort of lined the route for Catherine and Henry as they went towards Westminster Abbey. And if you want to, I do a little tour of London, like a virtual tour. If you want to get in touch, and we can recreate that route as Henry walked or rode to Westminster Abbey. But here we are, Westminster Abbey itself. Well, he stopped off at Westminster Palace, which was next door, which is now where the Houses of Parliament are. But then the next day, on Midsummer's Day in 1509, Henry was crowned, and Catherine was crowned beside him here in Westminster Abbey. Now, Henry's not buried in Westminster Abbey, and neither is Catherine of Aragon. Only one of his queens, that fourth queen he met on Blackheath, Anne of Cleves, she's buried inside Westminster Abbey. But his father, his mother, and both of his daughters and his legitimate son, they are buried here inside Westminster Abbey. And in this section, which you can see, This is a bit of a Tudor section that's been added on to the top of Westminster Abbey. So Westminster Abbey is shaped like a Latin cross with a long section where the nave is, and then the cross. And then this is the Lady Chapel, which sits on top of the short part of the cross. And you can see it's this gorgeous, gorgeous form of architecture we call perpendicular Gothic. Now, this was started by Henry's father, Henry VII, to be a place for his tomb. And that's his tomb there at the bottom there. And just look at this gorgeous ceiling that Henry VIII finished off for his father. Just this wonderful, wonderful chapel. And as I say, both of Henry's daughters are buried off to the side, and his son is buried, well, beneath our feet as we're taking the photograph here. But his father and mother are buried in front of us in that large protected tomb, and they have these lovely brass images that are on top of the tomb, that are some really great early Renaissance work that are put on there. Now, Henry VIII is actually buried elsewhere at Windsor, but before we go to Windsor, we're going to go to Hampton Court, probably the most famous. So we're sort of now traveling all the way west. We've gone just beyond Richmond and we've come to Hampton Court. And this is a picture of Hampton Court from across the river, in the early sort of misty light that I took at one point as I was going there to pretend to be Henry VIII for a day. And you can just see these beautiful chimneys. This is the sort of ideal of Tudor architecture when you're not building grand churches, you're building a palace or a home. And there are so many chimneys all around the place. If we have a look inside now, you'll see these courtyards that are inside Hampton Court Palace. Again, the chimneys everywhere. The actual architect of Hampton Court was Henry's councillor, Cardinal Wolsey, and he was showing off how rich he was because he had all these chimneys, all these different rooms lit, all these different rooms heated by fireplaces. On the left hand of the image there, you have Base Court, and behind that wonderful wine fountain that's running, there's the gatehouse. In Henry's day, in Wolsey's day, it would have been 2 stories higher, a grand sort of castle-like structure at the front of the palace, and that's where Henry and Catherine of Aragon stayed when they came to visit Cardinal Wolsey here. And the rumour is that Henry said, "Oh, this won't do, Wolsey. Your palace is much nicer than my one at Richmond. We'll have to do a swap." And well, what really happened is Wolsey realised things were going badly for him, and he actually gave Hampton Court to Henry VIII in an attempt to make Henry not want to get rid of Wolsey. Didn't work though. On the right hand image there, we can see that wonderful Great Hall there at the back, similarly to the Great Hall at Elton Palace, but now in this modern red brick that the Tudors were so fond in building in. And that Great Hall was actually built for Anne Boleyn, and it was built in honour of her. Unfortunately, she did not live to see it. She was executed before it was finished. But one of the great things you can do on a day out at Hampton Court is you can poke around in the Tudor sections looking for the sort of lost iconography of the queens. In that Great Hall, there's a little bit where you can see an A and an H next to each other entwined, and you can maybe spot Anne Boleyn's falcon somewhere. And also, back in the buttery, which is another part of the Great Hall, you can actually see pomegranates of Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. So there's all these little symbols hidden away that somebody forgot to replace when they updated the palace. Now, the palace itself is closed at the moment, but what is open are the gardens. So you can actually go now and look around the gardens. And here we have this beautiful day that I was there where the sun was beating down and drenching the gardens. And this is actually one of the sort of area in the formal gardens, and the ground plan was actually laid out by Henry VIII. So we're looking at what was a fish pond in Henry's day. Now it's a lovely sunken garden, very warm and good for plants that enjoy warm areas, xylophytes. But where is Henry buried? Well, we need to go even further west and outside of London there to Windsor Castle, and there we see that great big sort of figure of 8 shape, which is sketched out there like a lie down, maybe like an infinity symbol from here. And the sections that Henry was involved in are on the left there, down in the lower ward. And we can see that great big chapel dominating the area. And that's the section, I think you'll recognize the chapel when you see it, because it looks very similar to that Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey. There it is, the grand St George's Chapel, and you've got that perpendicular Gothic architecture, and on the left a couple of onion domes, so you can see Henry finished that off. Now he finished that right at the start of his reign, so again it had been begun in the time before him, but he finished it off in 1511, and it's this, again, it's got this wonderful ceiling inside that we have a picture of. It looks very similar to the Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey. It's just this gorgeous fan vaulting as those ribs support that great big almost flat ceiling above it, and all the badges there of the Order of the Garter that sit at Windsor. It's the Order of the Bath at Westminster Abbey, but you might recognise these stalls on either side here, because this is the site of quite a few famous weddings that have taken place recently. Not this one. This one is a famous wedding that took place quite a long time ago. This is the marriage of Edward VII to his bride back when he was the Prince of Wales. And you can just, if you really squint, just to the left of that window there, you can see Queen Victoria, Edward's mother, just looking down at him getting married. But this is the exact spot where Harry and Meghan got married a few years ago here in Windsor Castle, in the chapel, St George's Chapel. If we look, you see right at the front of the image here, you can't really see it very well, but in the ground there, that is where Henry VIII is buried. No great big tomb for Henry. He wanted an absolutely massive one, even bigger than his dad's. But because he left the country in such a sort of terrible financial state, and because he left it in so much turmoil between the different religions and his different children, unfortunately, they never got around to actually finishing off a grand tomb for Dad. So he's buried there, and in the same tomb, we've got a later monarch, Charles I, sorry, who's buried beside him, and he's also buried beside his third queen, Jane Seymour. So it's getting a bit busy in that tomb, actually. So Henry's buried at Windsor. He didn't just build the chapel, or finish off the chapel. He actually did some of his own building. He built this grand gatehouse here, and you've got those sort of octagonal towers that Henry was fond of putting on castles. And in the centre there, we have this line of icons of his early reign again. So you've got the on the far left, there's a fleur-de-lis. Sorry, it's a little bit grainy here, but on the far left, fleur-de-lis, because Henry said he was the King of France. And in fact, the Kings of England continued to claim they were the Kings of France right up until the Georgians finally stopped that in the early 1800s. And then you've got the pomegranate, which is the symbol of Catherine of Aragon again. In the centre, the Tudor rose, that wonderful red and white rose. Of course, you can't see the colours on here, but believe me, it's a double rose. And then the portcullis shape, the symbol of the Beauforts, to show that the Tudor royal line descending through Margaret Beaufort, Henry VIII's grandmother. And then just a picture of the gatehouse itself. So there we are. Those are just some of the places that you can visit here in London, and I've sort of drawn them out there on the map with Windsor on the far left, then Hampton Court, Richmond, Westminster in the middle there, just on top of the London picture, then the Tower of London, and then Greenwich, and they're all along the river, aren't they? So they're all sort of the monarchy of Britain always used the River Thames as a way of getting from A to B, like a sort of highway of its day. And the only one that isn't there is Eltham, which is just sort of sticking out down on the bottom left there. But Eltham was on the way down to Dover. So all these, so if you're heading out of London, perhaps you can head out to Eltham and then out to Leeds Castle, which was a point that Henry often stopped at and had some work done there, and all the way down to Dover Castle as well. Great days out away from London as well. But there we are, just a few of the places associated with Henry. I haven't covered everything. We could have done St James's Palace, but St James's Palace, you can't really go inside it anymore, but that's another one that looks great. And there's like a wine cellar that's hidden beneath the Ministry of Defence from Henry's lost palace of Whitehall. But there we are. That's just a little bit. If you want to, we've got Nick back here. I'm always happy to do virtual tours of this sort of thing. So, do look me up, William Harry Mitchell on Guide London. Sorry, Nick. Hello, welcome back.
Welcome back. Yeah, thank you, Will. That was fascinating. It's amazing, isn't it, how many places associated with Henry are still there? So you can still see little remnants of the places Henry would have known. I think you said he had 50 palaces around the country
Yes.
altogether.
Yeah. I think it's 52 that he built, but then there were more palaces around. So, I mean, it's a phenomenal amount of building work that he went through. And as I said, he actually had two palaces called non-such palace, which should mean there is no such other palace. But no, he built two of them. So, there were.
So if you've got the question for Will, now's the time to do it, because all you need to do is type it in the comments on Facebook or Twitter, and we can pick them up here. Anything you want to know about Henry VIII or any of his six wives, we've got a few comments already. Someone was asking about Greenwich Palace. Is there anything left of Henry's palace at all at Greenwich that you can see, or is it all being removed?
As I say, you can see some of the foundations, which are now like underneath so when you're going up the stairs to the painted hall, they've now opened up a section with a glass panel on it, and you can actually see down into the foundations. There are, also while you're down there, you should probably have a quick look at the bowling alley, which is down there. Again, not relevant to Henry, but you can bowl cannonballs at skittles, great fun, underneath the two halls there. And some of the Royal Observatory is built on the foundations. That's up the hill at Greenwich in Greenwich Park. That's built on the foundations of an even older tower, Duke Humphrey's Tower, that was built a few generations before Henry there as well. But the museum does a fantastic job of bringing you back and showing you the bits and pieces. They've got some of the tile work and, as I say, recreated some of the stained glass and the like. As well.
It's very distinctive, isn't it, the Tudor architecture when you see it, and even in the centre of London, when you go and see parts of St James's Palace, it's got that unique look that is very similar to the pictures you've seen in Hampton Court Palace.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yes.
So Julie says she loves Elton Palace. Elton Palace is a place not many people go because it's a little bit further out of London. But would you recommend it as a place for people to visit if they want to know more about Henry?
I think you should visit it anyway. There is some information. There's quite a bit of information on their medieval history, but as I say, it is just that one great big hall. But you can, at Eltham, go and walk around the moat, and you can see the exposed foundations of a lot of the Tudor palace there. But you really want to go inside and see the fantastic Art Deco palace as well.
Yeah, it's a very beautiful place, actually, Elton Palace, isn't it? It's well worth a visit. Here's a tricky one for you. It comes from Ruby Roy in Canada. She wants to know, what did Henry really die of? Do we know what Henry really died of?
No, we don't, unfortunately. It's one of these things because there were so many illnesses that were around when Henry was around that we just don't know what they were. For example, like the sweating sickness, which was this thing that just, like, from the descriptions, we just can't tell what it is. But everyone was dropping dead of it. You could be fine one minute, you could drop dead. Now, it could well have been gout. It could. Lots of people love to say it was syphilis. That's quite unlikely. And there was the fact that Henry, because he'd had his accident, he was getting really fat. He was eating the same meals that a young, fit, energetic, athletic king had been eating, and he was not doing the exercise to get rid of it. So he was getting bigger and bigger, but he was fantastically vain, and he loved how his calves were so muscular, and he would always try and show them off, and he would put garters, really tight garters, just under his knee to really sort of stress how big and bulgy his calves were. And his doctors were telling him, you've got to stop wearing those. You've got to stop wearing them. They're really giving you ulcers and all this kind of horrible stuff on your bottom legs. And we know that his legs smelt bad because possibly because of the wound, possibly because of these ulcers. And it could well have been infections from that killed him off.
You forget how primitive medicine was, don't you? He did have these ulcerated legs, and the doctors used to bleed them to try and remove all the pus from them. So they must have got incredibly infected. You say they must have smelled awful, and it can't have done him any good. No wonder he was in bad mood for so long.
Indeed.
Now you I know used to dress up as Henry when you did your previous job and take people around places like the Tower of London. What was it like to walk around these places actually in costume as Henry?
Well, I did used to dress up as Henry, and I still do. There's a YouTube channel, which I'm just going to point out, called Monarchs Anonymous, and you should go and have a look at that. That's some sort of history-based comedy that I still do. But when we actually got to be in the palaces wearing the gear, it was phenomenal, because these outfits that we were putting on, they were almost like theatrical costumes. So many layers, because it was about. You should get this sense of really what it was like to be there at the time, because for Henry, for those high-ranking Tudors, it was about showing that you were so rich, you couldn't even bend down to do your shoelace up, or your buckled shoe up if it came undone, because you just had so many layers, and it was quite uncomfortable, really. But it was showing off how grand you were, that you needed a servant to come and tie your shoe or do your garters up for you even tighter.
Ruby says she sees the resemblance between you and Henry VIII. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Pepe wants to know, have you seen Six the Musical?
I still haven't. I'm sorry. I'm a fraud. I still haven't seen Six. I've watched a lot of trashy TV like the Tudors about Henry, but I still haven't got to see that real pop culture icon.
For people who haven't heard of it, Six is a musical based on the 6 lives of Henry VIII. That was very popular in London until, of course, we got to lockdown. But hopefully we'll open up again once the lockdown is lifted, along with the rest of musical theatre. Thank you so much, Will. There's all kinds of comments from all around the globe here. Thank you for these virtual tours. Look forward to them every week. We hope to see you back in London soon. Can the wine cellar under the ministry be visited? I don't think it can it? Unless
no, not really.
Occasions.
But don't worry, because there is a wine cellar at Hampton Court, and it's almost an exact replica. So you go to Hampton Court and see the wine cellar there. And hopefully, by the time you go and see it, there'll be some of my friends dressed up as skivvies down in the cellar, telling you stories of the various underlings of the palace.
It's a fascinating period of history, and it's certainly so many places in London you can go and you feel the presence of Henry. You can even go and see some of his armour, can't you, at the Tower of London?
Absolutely, some great stuff. My little niece, who we took last year while it was briefly open, she still talks about Henry VIII's armour, and I guess you'll have to go and see it and see what caught her attention so much.
I think I can guess. It is amazing to look at this bit of metal and think that Henry VIII actually got into this. He was sort of built into this, and obviously you know exactly what shape he was, because armour is made exactly to measure. So it's a fascinating place.
Absolutely.
And thank you so much, Will.
Yeah, just say there's a similar suit at Windsor as well to have a look at. So both great places to see Henry's armour. Absolutely. So many places you can go and visit. And if you want to know more about any of the places we've talked about today, then probably the best place to go is our website, guidelondon.org.uk. You can find details of all the guides there, including, of course, Will. This is your page, Will. And you can find a little bit about Will and when he's available, and you can email him as well if you want to contact him. And also you can do and search for tours, and some of the tours the different ones that we offer. So things like British Museum, Westminster Abbey, Shakespeare tours, if you want to know more about Shakespeare. We've got museums, of course, Cotswolds, all kinds of things. And a lot of our tours you can do virtually as well, because obviously these places aren't open at the moment. We're hoping the lockdown will be lifted soon in the next few months, and we'll start to go and visit these places for real. But in the meantime, a lot of our guides can offer virtual tours to these places, which give you a little indication of what these places were like, and give you a bit of the history and a bit of the information as well. So thanks very much to Will for today's broadcast. We'll be back next Tuesday, and next Tuesday marks our anniversary of a year of these broadcasts. So next week we're actually going to look at some of the places in London associated with women, some of the women's statues, some of the places dedicated to women. History is very much a male preserve most of the time, but obviously there is a huge amount of history that is dedicated to women in London, and we're going to look at some of that next week. So do join us at that time if you can, 4:00 in the afternoon if you're in the UK, which is 11 a.m. in the United States, or might even be
12 because of the clock change. I think the States are only 4 hours difference from us at the moment for the next 2 weeks anyway. It all gets very confusing. Join us anyway, and if you miss it, you can catch it up on YouTube. So thanks again to Will for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you all again soon.